The Battle of the Plains of Abraham was a turning point in the 7 Years' War, as the great European powers of England and France would fight a short but effective battle that would forever change the balance of power in the New World. This battle would be a part of the much larger campaign to take the French colony of Quebec, under the command of Major General James Wolfe of the British Army. General James Wolfe would devise a plan to take Quebec City by allowing his fleet of roughly 49 ships, as well as 140 smaller support craft, to be stationed south of Quebec City in the St. Lawrence River. There, they would stage their plans to attack the city. Wolfe decided to land his men at L'Anse-au-Foulon, specifically at a small cove about 3 kilometers, or 1.9 miles south of Quebec City. This landing area would be situated about 53 meters, or 174 feet, below a plateau, which would require the British forces to climb a large cliff. Wolfe stated how this plan would require absolute secrecy and would eventually be carried out by night to stay anonymous. At first, a small group of soldiers would land at the northern shore of L'Anse-au-Foulon, where they would then climb the cliffside, seize a small, disclosed road that led to a small French lookout camp, and then overpower the garrison of soldiers stationed at the lookout camp. This action would allow Wolfe's remaining army of around 5,000 men to climb the cliff by a small, disclosed road that was under their control at that point and set up for deployment to march on Quebec City. This French lookout camp would consist of around 100 militiamen, led by French Captain Louis Dupont de Jabon de Vagar. You see, these men were only that, militiamen, and were not trained conscripts of the French army, so their experience was severely limited in European warfare and were mostly experienced in guerrilla tactics. The British soldiers would land at the base of the road and begin to commence the attack on the lookout camp. When the boats of the British force were noticed, a British officer, either by the name of Captain Fraser or Captain Donald MacDonald, was able to communicate to the French militiamen that noticed the boats with absolute perfect French, which would extinguish the raised suspicion. This attack would only lead one French militiaman to escape to warn of Wolfe's incoming army. Lieutenant General Louis Montcalm, a French commanding officer in charge of the defense of Quebec City, was notified by the militiamen that the English were entrenching. However, the soldiers' warning was dismissed, as they felt he had gone mad. After this encounter, Montcalm proceeded to go back to bed without investigating this warning. As morning rolled around, Wolfe prepared his army for battle against Montcalm's forces. Since Montcalm's men were not as experienced as Wolfe's army, they would be at a disadvantage throughout the battle. Montcalm would set his militiamen up along the British left flank along the tree lines, while his professional army was engaging up front, as he knew that they would not be trained to deal with European-style tactics. The bulk of Wolfe's army would form a shallow horseshoe formation that would circumference the entirety of the plains, roughly being 1 kilometer in length. Wolfe would call some of his men back, and in doing so would commence scorched earth tactics, so the French would be unable to use the houses for combat. The fire would become so intense and would lead Montcalm to underestimate the sheer size of the British force. Montcalm would then order a charge on the British forces. For Montcalm, witnessing himself the supposed size of the British force, decided not to wait for reinforcements, which would only hurt his advance. Because of the inexperience of the militiamen, Montcalm's men were not able to comprehend his tactics and therefore could not effectively perform what he commanded, so the charge was very disorganized and uncoordinated. As the French army approached the British lines, the British held their fire. After waiting approximately 2 minutes, the French would fire 2 volleys that were documented to be very disorganized. You see, a volley was a popular tactic used by European commanders where a line of soldiers would fire simultaneously, which would make up for the weapon's low rate of fire as well as inaccuracy. Wolfe, seemingly unaffected by this attack, ordered his men to prepare for 2 volleys and a charge. Wolfe would order his men to fire a volley at the French troops, shocking Montcalm, as 1 volley alone from the British was well more organized and impacting than his 2. The British would then march towards the French, fired a second volley that would break the lines of the French, and sent them into a general retreat. Wolfe would then situate himself on a hill in the plateau to observe the battle greater than before. Unknown to his men, Wolfe was hit in the hand during the first French volley but shrugged it off and continued to command without medical attention. Within mere moments afterwards, Wolfe was hit twice, 1 bullet lodging in the stomach and the second lodging in the chest. As Wolfe would fall to the ground dying, he noticed a young officer explain how the French were retreating. Wolfe, dying on the ground, gave out a few more orders to his officers, then said, "Now, God be praised, I will die in peace." His death would greatly affect the morale of his soldiers, but they continued to press on, knowing that they had the French in full retreat. Wolfe's officers would command a charge on the retreating French, but without suitable command structure, the charge was very sloppy and would result in numerous injuries in the British ranks. Montcalm would be struck later in the battle, either from a canister shot from British artillery or from repeated musket fire. Montcalm would suffer injuries in his lower abdomen and thigh, but nevertheless was able to make it back to Quebec City. Unfortunately, Montcalm would succumb to his wounds the next morning as the British were marching on the city. After the British victory in the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, the French would abandon Quebec City and much of settled Quebec afterwards, and the British would dig in to siege Quebec City and fight the French forces that still remained. Within days of the siege, the British and French would sign the Articles of Capitulation of Quebec. With that signing, Quebec City would officially be under British control.